So in this presentation, I'm going to be exploring the different dimensions of social capital and extending that understanding of dimensions to different levels of analysis. So what I'll cover is what the dimensions are, how they're understood in the literature. And I want to explore a little bit into their epistemological and theoretical basis as well, because I think it's really important to develop a strong theoretical foundation for social capital, and something that's often missing in a lot of approaches to social capital. Then we'll explore how we can understand different levels of analysis and then bring that together. So look at how each dimension of social capital may be different at each level. Then we'll have a look at some more practical things and how the dimensions, levels, typology might actually help us to understand social capital building initiatives. So a bit of practical application, as well as how we can use the typology to understand the different approaches to social capital. So I'll have a look at a couple of examples in the literature, and we can see how the typology can help us to position the theoretical approach within that typology. So this presentation, I'm hoping that whether you're a practitioner using social capital in some sort of application, or whether you're involved in some academic inquiry, I'm hoping that you'll get something meaningful from this presentation. For the academic perspective, I really hope that it inspires some fresh reflection, about the epistemological and ontological basis of social capital and the approach that you're taking to it, and how you might be able to build that theoretical foundation for your approach. And as I mentioned also about the practical application, it might give you some new ideas and new clarity on your work. So I don't think there's any doubt that social capital is considered to be a multidimensional concept. The various dimensions help us to organize the various aspects of social capital and provides us a framework for understanding the overall concept, which is quite a big and complicated concept. So if we look at the multiple dimensions, James Coleman acknowledged in the definition of social capital that it is a variety of different entities. So he doesn't attempt to make a list here of what these different things are, but they're the various aspects of social structure. So if we look at other definitions, we see that quite often 2 or 3 different dimensions are cited in that definition. So this is Robert Putnam's definition, which is one of the most commonly used. And he actually lists some of these aspects or dimensions of social capital in that definition. So he lists things like networks, as well as norms and social trust. And he makes some specific references about how they're used for mutual benefit, for coordination and cooperation. And we'll see the same with other definitions, but they might be a little bit more vague, perhaps. This is another popular definition, and they use the word resources here. So this is sort of an umbrella term that covers a whole range of relational resources that may include things like norms and trust and goodwill and reciprocity and a variety of things lumped sort of under that one umbrella of resources. But they do also make reference to relationships, another sort of dimension of social capital. Other definitions, this is Ostrom's definition. We can see shared knowledge and understandings, rules, norms, expectations, and of groups, again, that relational or structural dimension of social capital. And we'll see the same thing, institutions, relationships, and attitudes and values. So there's been many attempts to categorize the various elements and aspects of social capital into types or dimensions or functions. And quite a lot of these attempts have been based on relationships or the nature of relationships. So these are some examples. We see strong and weak, vertical, horizontal, open, closed, and so forth. And so that's been a popular way to categorize the different types of relationships. But there's other distinctions in the literature as well. So the structure and process distinction is quite an intriguing one. I'm not sure it's been used very much, but it sort of highlights 2 different aspects of social capital. There's the internal and external distinction, which I think is more focused on the application of social capital. There's the structural and cognitive, which is obviously very closely related to the one we're going to be talking about in this presentation, which is structural, relational, and cognitive. So there seems to be an emerging consensus in the literature around these 3 dimensions. And when I say an emerging consensus, it's really a minority consensus that's starting to develop. So in a recent review of 250 peer-reviewed journal articles, I found that about 29% of those articles were using some version of these 3 dimensions of social capital. So it's still a reasonably small percentage, but I think that it represents a growing trend and something that is quite a rigorous way to approach, with a strong theoretical foundation. So these 3 dimensions were established by Napier and Goschel in their 1998 article, and they say that they were building on the work of Granovetter's discussion of embeddedness. So we should dig a little bit deeper into what this embeddedness is and how it led them to develop these 3 dimensions. So the problem of embeddedness that was presented by Mark Granovetter was that a lot of approaches to social action are under-socialized, or in fact, they're over-socialized. And so the rational actor models, within the rational actor models, action is largely based on a calculation of cost benefits, whereas in the social actor models, action is driven by the normative assumptions actors share with other individuals with whom they interact. So from the under-socialized perspective, action does not reduce to abstract optimizing rationality, and it does not reduce to the inflexible cultural and normative scripts either. So Mark Granovetter's proposal was 2 types of embeddedness to avoid these problems of under and over socialized perspectives and to incorporate both of these things. So structural embeddedness and relational embeddedness. So within structures where meaning is derived from the position in structures, as well as embedded in relationships where meaning is derived by the nature and quality of these relationships. So one of the big questions in the social capital literature is whether or not social capital is located exclusively in networks or also located in the social structures or social organization. And we saw reference to some of these things in the definition that I presented earlier. So a common approach is to include relationships, often termed networks. And some approaches to social capital focus exclusively on networks, and the existence of networks represents social capital. But other people also include the qualities of these relationships, and these are things like trust and norms and goodwill. And then other authors also include the nature of social organization, norms of trustworthiness and reciprocity and other norms, as well as identity and belonging and shared understandings. And this really represents quite a divide in the literature. And some people approaching social capital as only being networks, and other authors also including social organization. And I think this really is quite a major division that is yet to be resolved in the literature, 2 major approaches. And what we find in social capital, there's a huge amount of variety about different approaches, different ways of thinking about it, different ways of approaching it. And I think this comes largely from the huge range of different disciplines from which people approach it. So when you think about social capital, it's really about human action. When people are cooperative and when they share, when they're helpful, it's largely about what people do. And what people do is largely about their experience. So if we think about the human action theory basis from different disciplines, we find that there's quite considerable differences. Within sociology and social theory, human action is largely socially situated. Whereas within economics, it tends to be more rational or utility maximization. And so I think this represents one of the major sort of tensions within social capital. And if we just simplify this a little bit, because of course there's a range of different disciplines, psychology and a range of other ones that could be taken into account as well, we really see this push and pull between these 2 disciplines. And some authors talk about the colonization of social theory by economics. And then there's also the push in the other direction where potentially social theory is actually transforming the nature of economics. But when we think about the theoretical basis, the epistemological basis within different disciplines, we find that there's quite considerable differences. And this can result in the way in which we think about social capital being very, very different. So in a very general sense, economics tends to be more on the objective end of the spectrum, epistemological spectrum, and tends to engage in positivism, primary sort of theoretical perspective. Whereas we see at the other end of the spectrum, in sociology, we tend to see, constructivist type epistemology and perhaps interpretivism. as the major theoretical perspective that exists in that area. So within social capital, there are these vastly different meanings for what social capital is, which I think stems from these ideas about, what the nature of human action is, different priorities, different interests, and different goals. And this has led authors to criticize the concept quite heavily, and I think quite validly, really, as well. So we have Tony Bebington talked about the confusion and ill-specified concept based on empirically unsound research. And we find some other criticism from Ben Fine, who talks about vulgar scholarship, really poor theoretical work that isn't tied to a strong theoretical perspective and mixes and matches different approaches. So I want to give one example of some of the major differences that we can find within social capital. And I want to talk about social norms and the meaning of social norms from different perspectives. So James Coleman's approach to social capital is often termed a rational choice perspective. So from that perspective, social norms are largely outcome oriented, based on self-interest. And so from this perspective, we see that it involves universalizing assumptions by ignoring non-outcome based actions as the nature of norms. Whereas Putnam's democratic perspective about social capital, social norms do not function exclusively to facilitate the efficient realization of individual preferences. They also foster the reflexive social cooperation that enables social realization of democratic ideals. So while this approach does not reduce social norms to rational norms, it rather inflates them to universalizing positive norms, which is one of the major criticisms of Putnam's approach to social capital. We then look at Bourdieu's Marxian perspective on social capital. We find that social norms are primary pre-reflective predispositions. And so what this is doing is it's avoiding reductionism and inflation. However, it tends to emphasize the non-voluntary predispositional reproduction of human action. Sort of human agency is a little bit lacking from this perspective of social norms. So this highlights the really significant variations in the understandings of a major component or a major aspect of social capital, that being social norms. So I've taken a little bit of a tangent there to explore a bit of the theoretical foundations, but I want to return now to the dimensions we've been talking about. So rather than structural and relational, coming from structural and relational embeddedness, we find that some scholars use the term cognitive, since from a constructivist epistemological stance, reality is constructed by experience, not just in relationships. And this really, I think, leads to that major division in the social capital literature. That from a constructivist stance, we experience a whole range of different things, not just in relationships, but in groups, but in society and in the media, and at all different levels. And so some authors then have chosen to use cognitive as the name of one of these dimensions. So we could break it into two dimensions, structural and cognitive. So within the structural category, it could be associated with the various forms of social organization, such as rules and roles and precedents, as well as a wide variety of networks. Within the cognitive category, this really derives from mental processes and the resulting ideas reinforced by culture and ideology, and specifically norms, values, attitudes, and beliefs. So this is some really interesting work that came from Norman Uphoff, and also in other publications with co-authors that explores these two areas, and particularly, I think, added quite a lot of value to that understanding of the roles and rules, and the way that this distinction, I think, has some merit. If we look at, say, the work of Bourdieu, he talks about fields and habitus, and fields kind of fits with the structural category, and habitus kind of fits with the cognitive category. And as far as I know, even though Bourdieu explored social capital quite significantly, I'm not aware of any work where he directly makes that connection between his own concepts of fields and habitus. We could also explore some other philosophical basis for these two categories. I think that would be a rich opportunity to explore how, say, Habermas's system and life world might fit with these categories. The structure and the system, I think, has a lot of similarities. And this cognitive category around mental processes probably fits quite well with life world. So from Uphoff's position, the structural category really facilitates cooperation. This is obviously a massive simplification, but it sort of helps to understand it. Whereas the cognitive category predisposes cooperation. So again, returning to these original structural, relational, cognitive dimensions, what Naffiat and Goschel did in their article was they categorized factors that were already existing in the literature. So the structural being things like patterns of connections, and the work of Ronald Burt was one of the key authors there, as well as trust and trustworthiness with Fukuyama and Putnam, norms and sanctions, obligations and expectations, and identity identification. Interestingly, in the cognitive dimension, they didn't actually cite any authors who worked on social capital, but I think that's a major contribution to talk about those shared representations and interpretations and systems of meaning, and because of course they affect human action and experience in quite significant ways. So the authors talked about the interrelationships between these dimensions, that they're highly complex, interrelated and overlapping, and they acknowledge that reality cannot be separated into distinct boxes. So while these dimensions are a useful analytical tool, they need to be understood for their complexity and interrelationships. And what we find when we start to analyze these dimensions is that there's huge amounts of interrelationships. A change in one area necessarily has change in others, and we need to acknowledge that complexity. So within the literature, some authors use a three-way distinction and others use a two-way distinction, and there's quite a lot of complexity about how these are conceptualized and used. Personally, I think the two-way distinction, between structural and cognitive, is sufficient. I think that's the major division that I see. But I don't think the third dimension, the relational dimension, takes anything away, and it can have some empirical and practical utility as well. So I'm really quite happy to go with the three dimensions. So I think this is the end result, bringing together the Naffiat and Goschel work as well as Norman Uphoff's work into one table that outlines these different dimensions without any consideration of levels. If you want to have a brief look at that. So this is on the website, and I've written a few articles that explore this in a bit more detail. So let's move on to looking at how we can analyze different levels and how social capital might be different at these different levels. So the typical way to understand levels in sociological inquiry is the micro level being, one-to-one, the meso level being really around groups or specific parts of society, and the macro level being, society as a whole, or broad systems of institutions and hierarchies, and patterns in society. So we can break this down, make it really, really simple. Micro being the minimum unit, and macro being the maximum unit, and meso being somewhere in between. So from its most simplistic point of view, we're talking about, individual relationships, groups, and society. So for social capital, what I thought was a good way to structure these levels was to say that at the micro level, we're looking at, factors related to or embedded in specific relationships, between known individuals. Meso being factors that are applicable in the context of a social grouping, whether that grouping is, a family or an organization or a sporting group or any group context. And macro being the factors that are generally relevant and widely applicable to a community or society. So what I did then was try to organize all of the different aspects of social capital by dimension and by level, and try and work out how they all fit together. And you'll see the reference to the levels here, the micro being factors related to specific relationships on the left-hand side. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different approaches to levels within the social capital literature. And the authors who tend to look at social capital as being exclusively relating to relationships, they quite often look at levels based on geographic scales. So micro being relationships between individuals, meso being between groups or firms, and macro being between regions and nations. And I've given some examples here of authors who tend to take that kind of approach to levels. So let's have a little example of how we might use the typology to understand a particular level. So I've highlighted here the meso level. So if we were looking at a particular group, then these are the sorts of factors and aspects that are relevant to the group. You know, the structure of the group, as well as the cognitive dimension, the shared understandings and the norms and identity. But of course, a group is made up of individuals and the individual relationships within that group. So we really can't ignore the top row, the micro level as well. And the group exists within the context of a wider society and community. And so we actually can't ignore the macro level factors as well because of the relationships that they have to it. So within any particular context, we need to really look at the entire typology and see which types of factors are going to be relevant for our particular context. And we'll explore a little bit more about specific cases later on. So what I want to do now is work through each of these quadrants of this table and talk about the dimensions at each level. I'm going to try and run through this fairly quickly because, of course, there's quite a lot to cover. So we're going to start up here in the structural dimension at the micro level. So just to remind you of what that is, the structural dimension is the configuration of patterns of social relationships, including the structures of social organization. And the micro level is the factors that are related to or embedded in specific relationships. And what I've included here is social networks. And I've made some inclusion here of bonding, bridging, and linking ties, and I'll talk a little bit about that, as well as network configuration and, importantly, associational membership. So the membership that individuals have in various social groupings, whether or not they're formal or informal memberships. So from a lot of perspectives, or some perspectives at least, social capital is only manifested by social interaction and only exists in social relationships. So we're talking about known individuals, people who you know, and structures that are created, such as networks and membership. And this is really important. This is a really important dimension of social capital, of course, because when we have interaction, we establish the kinds of shared understandings, the beliefs and values, and they're associated with many of the other dimensions of social capital. And we'll certainly see in the literature there is some exploration of the meaning of language and the importance of communication in the development and maintenance of social capital. So I think this quadrant is most easily understood as social connectedness, how connected we are to other people and the nature of our relationships and memberships. So simplistically, it involves knowing each other, and it's the existence of social networks of friends, family, colleagues, and acquaintances, and so forth. So as I mentioned, some approaches only focus on the nature of social networks and network configuration, and they're interested in characteristics such as density, bridges, structural holes, and homogeneity, and so forth. Other approaches focus exclusively on associational membership. An example of that would be some of Robert Putnam's work that really equates social capital with associational membership. So the microstructural factors are similar to the well-established theoretical tradition of network analysis, which is pre-existing theoretical framework before social capital that really focuses on the nature of the network. And there's some excellent scholarly work in this area by Nan Lin and particularly Ronald Burt, and of course a lot of other scholars working in that area. So I think an important question is to ask how the bonding, bridging, linking distinction fits in with the dimensions of social capital. So originally that bonding, bridging distinction was used to describe the nature of a social grouping. So Putnam credits Gittel and Vidal, 1998, with that distinction. And what they're really talking about is it's sort of a broad categorization that some groupings are inward looking, have dense networks and strongly focused on trust, whereas other networks or other groups are dispersed, They tend to have thin trust, and that's different types of groups. However, quite a few authors have taken that bonding bridging distinction and related it to specific relationships. So the relationship, say, between me and one other person, and describing that as being a bonding or a bridging tie. However, what that does is it really assumes the various relational and cognitive properties that relationship may have. So on the left-hand side here, these are the aspects or the characteristics typically understood of bonding and bridging social capital. So we can actually explore where these things fit on the typology. So bonding social capital here, I mentioned it here in the microstructural dimension. If we look at where thick dense networks is, that's network configuration. Thick trust would sit over here in the relational dimension. But it's also, if we're talking about trust within a group, it's also at the meso level. It's also between individuals who you don't necessarily know but are within the same group. Tends to be inward looking, so we're talking about identity and belonging. And strong ties, again, we're talking really about thick trust and trustworthiness. Bridging social capital is here. Dispersed networks is network configuration. Thin trust I place at the macro level because we're really talking about the way in which people generally trust other people within a society. It doesn't come necessarily from a specific group. So I think this is a useful way to understand, using this typology, to understand a concept like bonding and bridging social capital and what sort of aspects within other dimensions that we're looking at. So moving on now to, still within the structural dimension, but moving on to the meso level. So these are factors that are applicable in the context of a social grouping. So these are things like roles, rules, procedures and precedents, and of course, networks of institutions. So institutions that have relationships with each other. So humans create and identify with various social groupings. So I could be a member of my family, my neighborhood, my former university, my local church, my sporting group, my employer, my profession, my interest groups, and many other social groupings. And it may in fact be hundreds of different groupings that I identify with. And it's not necessarily formal groupings, it can be informal groupings. And in fact, other groupings that I see some form of similarity with. I have red hair, and so I may feel similarity and belonging with other people who have red hair, or based on gender or ethnicity or interest groups or any number of other things. So each grouping has its own structure, has rules and procedures and norms and shared understandings. And all of these different groups that we're members of, they all produce social meaning and collectively produce what I'm terming the life world. That cognitive dimension of social capital. And our understandings apply to each individual grouping, but of course they give us meaning and understanding overall that tends to have implications across different groupings in all of our existence. So all of these social groupings or fields, they overlap and interrelate in very complex ways. So the structural dimension at the meso level relates to the structure of the social grouping. So dictates the existence and nature of many social relationships and powerfully influences the nature of interaction and exchange between individuals. So the structure of the group that is, creates obligations and expectations, and it establishes patterns of action that are commonly understood by group members, thereby reducing uncertainty in ways that strongly influence various aspects of social capital. And so the work of Norman Uphoff, I think, has been really valuable in exploring how something like the role of the nature of roles can create patterns of interaction within a group and create reasons and motivation for people to interact and exchange, and the way in which it creates and reinforces social identity. And I've written an article on this on the website if you'd like to explore it in a bit more detail. And of course, looking at the work of Norman Uphoff could be useful as well. The rules, precedents, and procedures are also another way that social groups dictate patterns of interaction, and this can have various powerful implications for other aspects of social capital, such as norms, trust, belonging, and shared understandings. And Norman Uphoff talks about how patterns of collective action are constituted and sustained by a large array of rules, whether they're formalized or informal rules. Moving on to the macro level, I'm still within the structural area. So these are the macro levels factors that are generally relevant and widely applicable to a community or society. And these are things like coordinating institutions, law and enforcement, generalized patterns of institutional collaboration, and structures and systems that perpetuate social stratification. So I think, this macro level, we're talking really about, society and culture. We're talking about governance, and we're talking about, systems that create power differentials and inequality within society as well, which is, I think, something that's often overlooked in a lot of approaches to social capital, with the notable exception, of course, being Bourdieu's work in this area. So these factors relate to the macro social structure and the institutions that humans create, organize, and regulate social action. And these institutions really do, in most modern societies, they powerfully influence a wide range of social action, from fundamental things like births, deaths, and marriages, but also through to employment and housing and a wide variety of other actions and understandings. We could say that moral and cultural values are formalized into these structures and establish standards of thought and speech and action. But of course, these values that are formalized within these structures and the rules and laws that come from them, they're often from the ruling elite who really have that impact. So collectively, I like to call all of these various government and non-government institutions the coordinating institutions. And I think this is similar to a concept like institutional capacity. And macro social structures help to reduce uncertainty and various obligations. And these factors sometimes are called civic capital. And the authors, I think, who use the term civic capital, often they use that term to try to separate these important factors from the concept of social capital, which they see as primarily being about social relationships at the micro level. And they want to differentiate from that. So we move on now to the relational dimension. We'll talk about that at the micro level. So relational is the characteristics and qualities of social relationships. So again, back to the micro level being related to and embedded in specific social relationships. So these are things like trust and trustworthiness, norms and sanctions, obligations and expectations, and identity and identification. So while the microstructural factors are related to the configuration of networks, the micro-relational factors relate to the nature of these networks. So the existence of a network tie doesn't tell us very much at all about its qualities. So this is where the relational dimension comes in. Repeat interactions between people and the interpreted meaning of these interactions creates various understandings that influence the nature of future interactions. So a specific relationship between people can become imbrued with trust and various norms and obligations and expectations and various routinized and habituated patterns of action and interaction. And these are the sorts of things we're talking about at the micro level. So trust is a really important part of social capital. In fact, quite a few authors have really equated trust with social capital and agree that it's really at the core. Trust is vital for any form of social interaction or exchange, and trustworthiness lubricates social life is a common term way it's described. At the micro level, this type of trust can be called relational, particularized, personalized, situated, or thick trust. And it really must be acknowledged that trust is a complicated concept that cannot be reduced to a simple dichotomy of trust or not trust. And it's highly contextual and contingent. And so there's an entire theory and literature around trust. And this is really just giving a very brief overview that it exists and it's important within the concept of social capital. Social norms is also a really important part of social capital because it powerfully influences the nature of human actions. And so we often talk about just purely the norms of trustworthiness or the norms of reciprocity, but there's a very wide range of norms that are applicable to social capital that relate to the nature of any type of human action that is potentially productive or perverse. So really, think about strong social capital being associated with pro-social actions and these sorts of norms that discourage exploitation and that create mutual benefit. So you'll see there's a bit of a gap in the typology here at the meso and macro level. And the reason is because if we say that the relational dimension relates to the qualities of relationships, then that's only really going to be relevant to specific relationships at that micro level. But of course, it's maybe not quite so simple. And a lot of these factors, I think the trust and trustworthiness and norms at the higher levels end up being cognitive factors. So moving on to the cognitive dimension, these are the shared understandings that provide systems of meaning. So these are things like shared language and codes and narratives and shared values and attitudes and beliefs and shared goals and purpose. I think this is really important because from a constructivist epistemology, individuals construct their realities based on their personal experiences and perceptions. So interaction and communication is required to bridge these somewhat disparate realities and to create these shared understandings. And without these shared understandings, individuals' realities might be quite different. We have phrases in our language to describe this when we're not on the same page, we're not speaking the same language, we don't understand each other. And in those situations, it's quite difficult for people to be pro-social, to work together, to collaborate and be cooperative. So I think that the cognitive factors are very similar at all levels of analysis, whether we're looking at the micro level all the way up to the macro level, because we're talking about the same sorts of things. We're talking about people being on the same page and having the kinds of cognitive tools to be able to interact and exchange and communicate with each other. And so I've included shared language and shared narratives and shared goals at all of the levels. So authors who locate social capital as the property of the individual will tend to focus on the structural dimension and individual agency, whereas authors who see social capital as a property of the collective tend to focus more on the cognitive dimension. And we certainly see that in the literature when we look at the kind of factors that are included. So I want to give a very brief overview of these three. This is a really important part of social capital, so could be explored in much more detail. But shared language is critical for effective communication. So shared language is things like terms, vocabulary, and jargon that is used by a social group or in a social setting. And we see that this is being really important, and it can be a real barrier to interaction and exchange where there's a lack of shared understanding. It's vital to the development of shared goals. It can weaken shared identity when we don't have it, and it can undermine solidarity and a sense of belonging when it's absent. And we can just feel different from other people when the language, the terms, the jargon that's being used is different. So part of this is also the shared narratives. So shared narratives are those commonly understood myths, stories, and metaphors that give order to human experience and solidify meanings for those who live, create, and interpret them. And this is also really important for people to have the same sort of or a similar basis for an understanding of the social reality and the foundation to be able to interact and exchange in a meaningful way. And shared goals and purpose, those collective aspirations of actors and the shared sense of destiny with others, which again is really important to facilitate coordination and working together for mutual benefit. If there isn't shared goals, people don't really know what they're supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be focusing their efforts, and we don't see the same sort of productive outcomes, particularly from groups. So as I mentioned, the factors are very similar at the meso and the macro levels. Here I've included those relational properties, but I've brought them over here to the cognitive level since they're related to groups, not just to specific relationships. Of course, groups include social relationships, but not necessarily every member of a social grouping knows and has social relationships with every other member of a social grouping, which is why I've brought them in here. I'm going to move through this just quite quickly because I'm aware of the time and I want to get on to a couple of other more practical examples. So I'm just going to skip over this one. And macro cognitive, again, the same sorts of factors, but I've tacked on the bottom here those shared understandings that perpetuate social stratification. You know, those sort of macro level cultural or religious views that create some sort of, you know, social stratification within society. So I want to move on to an example of using the typology to improve social capital at different levels, because this is often, you know, a really strong focus of social capital is to improve it in some sort of a context. So when we're thinking about building social capital, these are the four sort of common ways to do that. Now, thinking about building social capital for an individual, or within a group internally, or from a group looking out externally, or broadly, not related to a specific group. So some examples might be for an individual, you might want to improve life prospects very generally, or some specific activity like employment opportunities. Internally, you might want to generally improve performance or a specific activity like innovation. And there's other examples as well. So we can use the typology then for different levels to understand and to look at the types of factors that might be relevant. And so what I've done is, using this typology for an individual, I've pulled out the kinds of factors here that I think are most relevant and important. So it's really about, for an individual, position within structures. So being more active, more connected, more engaged. So having more social relationships, having memberships within the various structures, and having important roles within those structures that create patterns of interaction and various expectations and norms and obligations and so forth. We can improve the nature and quality of social relationships. And a big part of that is reputation and goodwill. You know, being giving and sharing and helping and caring and all those kinds of things that helps to create those relational resources with other people. And of course, the shared understandings, you know, being open and honest and communicating with others to reach these shared understandings. And this really relies on interpersonal competencies, you know, empathy, theory of mind, you know, emotional intelligence, various communication skills, you know, like conflict resolution, problem solving, all of these types of things can really help from an individual perspective. And so you can see how, using that typology, I've been able to very easily use it as really a framework for understanding what could be used to improve social capital for an individual and pull out these factors. If we look at how we might build a social capital for a group internally, we might look at the institutional structure. So I've used the word institution here, but I'm really talking about any social grouping whatsoever. So establishing roles and clear rules and procedures and precedents that align with group purpose and help to structure the organization and the action within that organization, which of course has powerful implications for norms and various other aspects of social capital. Within the relational dimension, we'd want to encourage strong and positive norms, you know, trustworthiness and reciprocity, but also norms of behavior in relation to every aspect of the organization, aligning with what it is the organization does. Also encouraging strong and positive identity and belonging. And social identity is a really important motivator of human behavior and influences human action in really strong and significant ways. And we can have a look at evolutionary biology for you know, the roots of the reasons why social identity is so important for human experience. And of course, developing shared language, developing the shared values, and developing the shared goals. These are the things that are really important for a group to work effectively together. And I see the cognitive dimension as, you know, really being one of those critical aspects. So again, using typology, we can pull out the various aspects of social capital that are important for that context. Another way social capital is often used is external to the group. And I think really this talks about when, you know, an organization wants to improve social capital in a project or, you know, public relations, you know, in their customer base, external to the organization or the group itself. So structurally, it's really about establishing patterns of interaction, Relational, I think this is largely about reputation and goodwill that's developed by the group to the external social environment. And of course, cognitive is developing that shared language and codes and narrative, so forth. For a community, then, structurally, establishing social structures, encouraging membership and participation, establishing coordinating institutions, clear messaging about what those coordinating institutions are, about the rules and the enforcement of those rules that are fair and equitable and clear, and all of those sort of structures can be a really effective way to build social capital. Relational, to encourage strong and positive norms within the community, and cognitive, having that shared language and developing the shared values, and particularly things like inclusion and respect and acceptance and appreciation, the types of shared values that of course would be good to encourage the development of within a community. So moving through this quite quickly and where we're running out of time. If we look at how we can use the typology to understand the different approaches in the literature. So I've taken an example here of a fairly recent article from 2019, I think it was. So the way that this article defines social capital is the beneficial resources in relations between people. And they conceptualize a distinction between horizontal and vertical social capital. And when I see that, I immediately think they're going to be talking about structural and horizontal, vertical and horizontal networks, and they're going to be taking a very structural approach to social capital. So it's a quantitative research, and this is the way in which they measure social capital. These are the factors that they included in vertical and horizontal respectively. And as I mentioned, we would really think that vertical would be the nature of networks, and horizontal would also be the nature of networks, and that would be all that they actually looked at. But when we actually look at each of these things that they measure, we actually find that they're cognitive. So confidence in management, I thought that's really about shared language and codes and narratives. Trust in managers in the relational dimension. Immediate manager contributes so that we can best achieve. So that's really about, obligations or perhaps identity. Treats us with respect. I think it's probably also in the relational area here. Employees are involved in decisions regarding workplace. So I think this is around shared goals and shared purpose. So you can see that all of these factors really relate to how employees feel, what they think and their perceptions, really in that sort of broad cognitive dimension, and they haven't really looked at the structural dimension at all. We'll have a look at the horizontal measures, run through these fairly quickly. Again, we see that they all fit into either the relational or the cognitive dimension as well. So again, all factors relate to how employees feel, what they think and their perceptions. So if we go back to the original definition, beneficial resources in relations between people, and we ask that question, does their definition fit with their approach? What's their theoretical framework? And I think there is, the word resources is very vague, but I think it does fit. Perhaps the vertical and the horizontal was a little bit misleading to me initially. I thought they were going to be talking about structures, but it ended up fitting quite nicely with the cognitive dimension of social capital. And for me, it understood it to be within that constructivist epistemological framework, even though they didn't make any reference to their theoretical perspective in their article. Have a look at one other example. So social capital in this case was understood by the ways in which individuals are embedded in social organizations that facilitate cooperation for mutual benefit, including civic and community engagement. And again, it's quantitative, and they developed this particular instrument that included three main areas: civic engagement, adult support, and community support. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these 16, but broadly speaking, if we have a look at where they fit within the typology, community and neighborhood are supportive. I thought this is really about sort of macro level, the whole community being supportive, This is probably a cognitive level. Adult support, so adults give you information about how to do things. Yes, I think this is probably maybe in that norms area, what's normatively appropriate and expected. And then if we look at civic engagement down here, we're really talking about associational membership. So this seems to be a bit of a split. You know, we have a lot of macro cognitive factors, and then we have a microstructural factor. And I think what they've done here is they're saying that the civic engagement connects people to those macro structural understandings. You know, that by having those memberships, they're connected with the community, they're engaging and talking, and they're developing an understanding about what is normatively appropriate and expected within society, and therefore they're more likely to adopt and take on board those norms. So they don't make that distinction. They don't build that theoretical framework in the article. I think that they perhaps intuitively, or maybe perhaps even coincidentally, came up with that particular framework. And I think they could have benefited from delving into the theory a little bit more to understand the reasons for these various inclusions. So in summary, I think the typology can encourage consideration of theoretical perspective. And I think a lot more of that is required in the literature and the use of social capital. It can provide a framework for understanding social capital, just generally speaking, the dimensions, the different aspects, how they fit together at different levels. Oops, moved on from that. Provide structure to the social capital interventions. So we want to build or change social capital, we can have a look at the level, we can have a look at the different dimensions, and we can pull out the aspects that we think are most relevant and identify those factors and processes that are relevant to our particular context or interest. But I think there are still some important limitations with this typology and with this dimensions construct overall. I think the theoretical foundation is still not clearly defined and robust. You know, I've talked a bit about constructivism, I've talked a little bit about interpretivism perhaps, but I still don't think there's a really strong theoretical foundation that underpins this in a strategic way. And this typology does take a particular epistemological framework that isn't necessarily going to be applicable for all disciplines and all different approaches to social capital. And so I think part of the reason why 29% of the literature currently, based on my sample, is using this dimensional approach is partly because it doesn't necessarily fit well with the epistemological framework in different disciplines. I still think there's the various inconsistencies and tensions that remain unresolved. And I think more work needs to be done. Part of it may just be that some factors, reality can't be separated into boxes, and so some factors perhaps sit differently within that framework, or could be in more than one place. But I think there's some more work to be done there. And I still think it doesn't really resolve some of the problems, the empirical and methodological issues, particularly those associated with the pre-reflective nature of social capital, particularly the cognitive dimension, and the potentiality of social capital as well. A lot of authors make specific reference to the fact that social capital is a potential. Some definitions even talk about the actual and potential resources, that are embedded within social relationships. And so I think that these issues are still yet to be resolved, particularly in empirical investigation of social capital. So more work to be done, but my really feeling is that this typology is a step in the right direction, or a step that may help to explore what these things are and resolve some of these issues.